I'll stay sat down because when you're tall, it's often difficult to read your notes from a low table. So forgive me for that. My name's Kevin Marr. I suppose it's a bit slightly like an AA meeting. I've been a Labour Party member for about 25 years. I've been one of these people, literally kind of man and boy in the Labour Party, and I suppose some of the reflections that I've got tonight bear that in mind. That I've kind of been around Labour politics for a very long time. I've worked for the Labour Party. I was a press officer here in the north of England. I was a special advisor to the last Labour Northern Ireland Secretary, Sean Woodward. I've kind of done every job from shoving leaflets through doors to to literally advising a cabinet minister and everything in between, and constantly do that as well. So I've slightly got the scars on my back, I guess, in terms of Labour politics. But let me start by doing something that people in politics don't usually do, which is answering the question very directly. Is Labour too broad a church? No, it isn't. The British parliamentary system requires political parties to be agglomerations of interests. There are kind of immutable physics to British politics. One day after a general election, somebody is going to stand on the steps of Downing Street and form a government. We know that's going to happen, and all the political parties are to varying degrees coalitions. The Labour Party is a coalition. There's plenty of people in the Labour Party I will passionately disagree with on all kinds of issues, all manner of issues. But I recognise that there's enough equity in what I believe and what they believe in that kind of concentric space between two core positions where we can cooperate, we can find a space where we have a mutual interest across enough issues to keep the Labour Party in business. And it's the same with all the other parties. The Conservative Party is a coalition of free market radicals, social traditionalists. The Liberal Democrats are increasingly a coalition of social liberals. If you think of people like Charles Kennedy, people like Tim Farron, who's a very nice chap, and Gladstonian economic liberals, people like Nick Clegg, who is probably not so quite a nice chap. They've got very different views on society and the economy, but they kind of agree enough in the centre to kind of hold themselves together, although of course there's only 8 of them these days, so it's not that difficult. UKIP, I was at the UKIP conference for academic purposes a few weeks ago in Bolton. I have to make that caveat clearly. UKIP's a coalition. It's a coalition of eccentrics. It's a coalition of nationalists. It's a coalition of free traders. It's a coalition of people who are bothered about immigration. It's a coalition of people bothered about social tradition. So all the political parties are coalitions of one form or another, even the SNP, which, as the name suggests, Scottish nationalism is their thing. But within that, there are people within the SNP that disagree fundamentally. There are people on the left, that would be on the left of the Labour Party in the SNP. There are people, frankly, who would be in the Tory Party. So all the parties, by necessity, are coalitions. So being a broad church kind of goes with the territory, I think, in British politics. And Labour is and always has been a broad church. It's a coalition of working-class tribalists. It's a coalition of Fabian gradualists, intellectuals, trade unionists, neo-Marxists, liberal progressives. Labourism used to be the kind of collective term that's kind of dropped out of fashion, really, to kind of describe Labour's approach and its philosophy and its political economy. Herbert Morrison, who was the leader of the Greater London Council in the 1930s, famously sort of brushed off descriptions of what Labour's version of socialism was by saying socialism is what the Labour Party does, full stop, that's it. He wasn't a great believer in sort of pluralistic political dialogue, Herbert, and his grandson wasn't either. His grandson's Peter Mandelson. I suppose the question that prompts the question, if you like, is: has the Labour Party lost coherence and definition in recent years? Is it too broad a church? Is Jeremy Corbyn to blame for wrecking the Labour Party by dragging it to the left? Or did Tony Blair sow the seeds of Labour's kind of problems and poor run by pushing the party too far to the right? I don't want to sort of dodge the question, but I suspect there's elements of both of those statements are true. Labour has faced structural problems over the last 30 or 40 years, really. The end of the post-war economic consensus from the Second World War, the idea that full employment, growing the economy, ameliorating the worst excesses of the market was axiomatic in British politics. The Tories, frankly, believed in a lot of that as well. The famous One Nation Tories, you couldn't really put much difference between their version of running the economy, run society, and Labour governments of the 60s and 70s. That broke down towards the end of the 1970s, and in a sense, Labour's been struggling ever since with some of those issues. The Thatcherite sort of hegemony of the 80s and the 90s, and the changes that she wrought, and John Meagher after her as well, you know, these have provoked massive problems for the Labour Party, the individualisation of society, the atomisation, you know, the breakdown of collectivism. We're still sort of grappling with a lot of those issues. You know, what political scientists call de-alignment, the idea that if you're working class, you vote Labour, then when you go to university and you get an office job, you're middle class and you don't vote Labour. Now I mean, we went through that period certainly in the 80s and 90s, and I think it was kind of broadly true. I don't think it is anymore. 60% of people consider themselves working class. I would do myself. So actually, you know, a lot of these issues have kind of become very fragmented, and Labour's traditional sense of itself has kind of suffered for quite a long time. A lot of these problems predate Jeremy Corbyn. You know, I don't blame Jeremy Corbyn for all the Labour Party's travails, and in a sense, Tony Blair was a reaction to some of those problems as well. So in a sense, it's not all his fault either. But I think if you look at New Labour, you look at the creation of New Labour, and it's very apposite to do that because it's 20 years in a few weeks' time since Labour won the landslide general election in 1997 with a 148-seat majority, just absolutely kind of dominated the political agenda for that mid-1990s period, certainly. Bob Marshall-Andrews, a famous sort of left-wing Labour MP who didn't like Tony Blair from the start, reacted to a poll in August in 1997 when Tony Blair was extremely popular, which showed 93% of people thought Blair was doing a good job. And Bob Marshall-Andrews famously quipped, "That's 7%, we can build on that." So you look at that period, that 1997 period, and you look at New Labour's governing credo. I mean, you know, famously, what matters is what works. This is post-ideology. This is, you know, the language of kind of community, rights and responsibilities, prudence with a purpose, all these other kind of fairly dismal alliterative phrases. But it's what it did was to sort of show Labour's orientation was trying to anchor itself in the political centre ground. It was trying to win over Middle England. It was trying to hold what it had on the centre left because there was nowhere else for working class Labour voters to go. And many of them, of course, supported Tony Blair enthusiastically. That needs to be said. But Blair could move effortlessly into Middle England and mop up all that political space and all those votes. And it was very successful for a long period of time. Blair kind of looked the part. He's a London barrister. He went to public school. He was posh, frankly. He managed to project himself and the New Labour brand into areas where Labour traditionally struggled to do that, mopped up all these marginal seats, and of course with that massive majority in 1997, and then again in 2001, dominated the kind of political map for a very long time. There were a lot of successes in New Labour's watch. You know, it needs to be said, and it's churlish of his opponents, wherever they come from, to kind of disown a lot of that. You know, there were massive reductions in child poverty, the Northern Ireland peace process, and kind of everything in between, really. But the charge I would make, you know, and I would categorise myself certainly as no Blairite, the charge I would make is that New Labour's problem, its fundamental weakness is its programme was not truly transformational. It was ameliorative. There were good things that happened, but it wasn't transformational enough. Jobs were created. We had a kind of period of full employment, but those jobs, often in low-value jobs, low-wage jobs, in leisure, tourism, these kind of growth sectors, the hourglass economy, the famous hourglass economy of middle-class professionals at the top doing very nicely, and loads of crappy jobs at the bottom, and not much in between, wasn't challenged, wasn't dealt with. So if you look at this part of the country, the whole north of England, manufacturing, industry, steel, coal, shipbuilding, these industries did not have a renaissance. They did not come back. They continue to either disappear or atrophy. And what went with that was the kind of skilled, higher average earnings kind of jobs that were absolutely essential to so many parts of the north of England. And throughout those New Labour years, you know, the south of England did extremely well. London did incredibly well. There was a lot of equity put into cities. All their cities are much nicer places than they were 20, 25 years ago. I mean, you know, just across the board. But you walk out of this city or any other city in this country, a quarter of a mile in any direction, and you will still hit grinding poverty, because a lot of that benefit and that improvement did not pass over into areas just immediately beyond the core cities, and certainly into the big towns. I mean, there's a massive challenge that was kind of left there. So New Labour did a lot of good things, but it wasn't transformational. It didn't make change across the board, and that change didn't stick. And I think when you look at the legacy of the 2010 period onwards, the Tories come in, we've got austerity, we're a response to the crash, the public spending tap is turned off, and a lot of New Labour's achievements kind of wilted very, very quickly as a result of that. A lot of it was fueled by increases in public spending. We weren't transformational enough. So I think that's the problem, in a sense, if you like, with New Labour. I think there's a problem also with the left, if I may say that as well. What all Labour governments have found throughout history is that there is always a backlash to Labour periods of government, and there have not been very many Labour periods of government. You know, in the 20th century, Labour governed for 23 years out of 100 years. You know, it's a pretty woeful electoral record, I have to say. But you look at the commonalities. Clement Attlee's great reforming post-war Labour government, which created the National Health Service and the core elements of the welfare state. It was out of office in 1951, booted out, massive party infighting because of the imposition of charges for glasses and dentures. They were free on the NHS at the start. It was quickly realised this was probably unaffordable. Charges were brought in, massive infighting in the party, and we spent the 1950s and early 1960s in opposition. Harold Wilson won in the 1960s. Spending cuts that hit the economy after the devaluation of the pound in 1967. Again, Labour in government regarded as a failure, criticised by the left, and then we have another period of infighting. Then, famously, in the mid-1970s, the sort of backlash of decline of the global economy hit the Labour government of James Callaghan. It had to go to the IMF for an emergency loan. The strictures of that loan wiped out its spending programme, which was a very radical manifesto in 1974. It wanted an irreversible transfer of wealth and power to working families. I mean, it was a very bold statement, and that manifesto was effectively ripped up in 1976 because spending cuts were part of the IMF bailout deal. Then the Labour Party kind of goes into kind of psychological breakdown in the late 70s, early 80s, and then nearly 20 years in the wilderness. And then you get Blair, and then you get post-Blair, and in effect, our history repeats itself. There is a pattern of behaviour. We probably promise too much in government, don't seem to deliver enough, and then there is a backlash from the left of the party, and that infighting then costs us election after election defeat after election defeat, and that's, unfortunately, Labour history for you in a nutshell. That said, we're all in politics because we want to change the world. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That impulse to want to do that is absolutely fine. My 25 years in Labour politics would tell me that's got to intersect with political reality at some point. Idealism has got to intersect with political reality, otherwise realpolitik and the world as it is just washes over you, and you've had it. And that's, in a sense, where I think Labour is right now. That's the nub of the issue. Labour, historically, is a party of reform. It's not a party of revolution. It's a social democratic party or a democratic socialist party, and there's a interesting sort of nuance there between how people would describe themselves. I would describe myself always as a democratic socialist. Labour is not a Marxist party. It is not a movement in that respect. It's not a pressure group. It's a democratic political party committed to parliamentary representation. That's the way you get things done in our political system. You can have your protests, that's fine, to help to change the discourse. But fundamentally, it's seats in Parliament. That's what it's about. That's how change is brought about in this country. And as I say, there's better people than me, got the scars on their backs too, having fought that fight. So parliamentary politics, by definition, involves compromise. It involves and necessitates cooperation and persuasion and reaching out and winning more votes than the next guy. That's how it works. That's the immutable law of British politics. Often, I have to say, the left has been equivocal about that. And I understand why. I understand, you know, the politics of compromise you know, is very difficult. And for some people, often perhaps from the Blairite right of the party, they seem to have grasped it with a little too much alacrity in the past, and have perhaps wanted to do less and enjoy perhaps the trappings of power. So I get the impulse from the reaction from the left and from the Corbynite left about that. I totally accept that. But you cannot ignore the fact that Jeremy Corbyn is 24 points behind the Tories in the latest polls. He's behind amongst every group of voters in every part of the country. Working class voters, men, women, older people, young people. Something fundamentally is not working. That said, I don't want to see people who believe in Jeremy Corbyn leave the Labour Party, just as I don't want to see people, the neo-Blairites, if I can call them that, I don't want to see them leave the Labour Party either. It must remain as a broad church. The challenge for us all is to synthesise an offer that appeals to enough of the electorate to win an election. It all comes down to that immutable law. It means putting forward a balanced, credible offer that's rooted in reality, in the mainstream, is capable of seeing a Labour government elected and re-elected. There's no single wing of Labour opinion that has all the answers. You know, I would never make that claim. You know, it's a bit like, I was going to say a bit like a box of chocolates. It's a bit like a box of roses. Variety is what politics is about, and what all political parties have got to be about. So is Labour too broad a church? No, it isn't.